right, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So again, for anyone who just joined, welcome to the post-Dreamforce recap webinar here with Salto. We're going to be digging into some of the hottest topics that we saw here at Dreamforce, and then going into a little bit more about how Salto can help your admins and developers create a consistent change management process with your Salesforce instance. So just a quick intro for myself. My name is Scott Dixon. I'm a customer engineer here at Salto, and I'm joined here by our co-founder and CTO, Gil Hoffer.
Thank you, Scott.
And just a few housekeeping before we get into the webinar itself. So the session is recorded. We will be following up after the call with a link to the recording and a little bit more in terms of links and resources for you to learn more about Salto and the overall Salesforce ecosystem. We're going to be putting a couple polls and then a survey at the end, asking you for your feedback on the session. We'd love to get your feedback in that survey that we're going to put in the last part of our webinar here. And just to let you all know, we're going to have a little kind of drawing here at the end. So there's going to be a section to put in your address if you'd like to get some Salto swag in case you weren't able to make it to our booth at Dreamforce. So make sure you put in your address, and if we draw your name, we'll be sending you some cool Salto swag. And then please use the Q&A module. It's part of the Zoom webinar. You should see like a little bar at the bottom. You'll be able to open up the Q&A section to ask any questions. We'll make sure to get those either answered during the webinar, or if need be, we'll follow up after the webinar directly with more details. And then just in terms of timing, we've got the full hour, the full 60 minutes here for the webinar. However, it may not take that long. It really depends on kind of the questions that we get here. So we'd love to get your questions. So please please put those in the Q&A, and we will get those answered along the way, and then really focus during the second half of today's session on answering some of those questions. So let's dig right into it. So I will let Gil kind of take over and start to share a little bit more about what we saw at Dreamforce.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Great to talk with you all. Now, for those of you who have been to a Dreamforce before, it might be a little bit overwhelming, right? We've got, I don't know, 45,000 people all crowding San Francisco. So it might be a little bit hard to sometimes identify some of the main announcements that are actually relevant to you. Now, the first one, everyone heard about it, right? There is no way that you've been in the ecosystem and haven't heard about Agentforce, right? Because basically everything in Dreamforce was around Agentforce or around AI and generative models in general, right? So we've had Cybertrucks roaming the streets with agent something, and we had probably north of 100 sessions talking about AI and LLMs and generative AI at the conference. Now, don't get me wrong, right? Some of the demos were super cool. The ones that I liked the most were the ones that involved Slack in it, because it really did create a very nice user experience around the interaction between Slack and Salesforce and the user and the agents. And there is value there, but from many conversations that I had with Salesforce customers and with other partners, we are at the peak of the hype, basically, right now. And there is value here, but there is a question of, is this the call? As so many of the trailblazers that we're talking with are still struggling with so much more basic aspects of the day-to-day. And we've seen many vendors actually talking and partners talking about AI in big booths and labels. And one of the concerns that I heard from quite a few analysts is that we might be becoming defocused right now in the ISV ecosystem, And because many of the different vendors felt like they had to talk about AI, they had to talk about the relevancy for Agentforce, and some of the substance is still missing. Now, typically in these kind of cycles, the core value will get refined, and then everyone will see lots of value, I think, eventually from Agentforce and AI. Right now, it's still very, very noisy. But I think that, well, everyone who was at Dreamforce or following some of the announcements, we can't ignore it. One of the relatively a little bit disappointing part right now is that not many of the, like, let's say, metadata aspects of Agentforce are actually available right now through APIs and the metadata API, etc. So the actual impact on DevOps is in some cases a little bit negative, but this will, and that's, I know that from relevant persons at Salesforce, this will pick up and get solved. Now, let's move to two other announcements that were a little bit not as noisy, but I think that are actually very interesting. The first one, for those of you who've heard about it, is Scratch org snapshots. Now, I know that using Scratch orgs is not that common still with many of the enterprise customers. And one of the reasons for that was because actually getting a relevant Scratch org to your organization can be challenging. Scratch org snapshots, if you haven't noticed that announcement, basically makes it much, much, much faster to get a Scratch org, which is with the relevant metadata that you actually need for your for day-to-day, basically taking it down into seconds or a few minutes when you compare it to just working with a sandbox. So I am very curious to see and excited to see how the community will adopt it, because it has a great potential of improving our day-to-day when we deal with Salesforce configuration. One of the motivations, by the way, for Scratch org snapshots is also around being able to use agents and Agentforce in Scratch orgs, right? Eventually. And another announcement, well, most of you are probably familiar with DevOps Center, right? It's the DevOps solution by Salesforce that haven't shown a lot of progress over the last year and a half or so. There weren't too many announcements talking directly about DevOps Center, but an interesting one was around DevOps Center testing, which is basically being able to integrate DevOps Center with existing testing tools. And it is very interesting that Salesforce is taking here a best of breed approach for testing, meaning they're relying on partners, they're relying on third parties that are focused on testing to solve that issue, and then they integrate it into DevOps Center for gates, etc., which is actually very similar in the same approach that we have at Salto around let's making sure that, well, testing is important, is a critical part of DevOps and release pipeline. There are companies who are experts in that. We need to make sure that the architecture of the CI/CD or DevOps platform that we're using can connect to that. So in high level, these were the ones that the main announcements that we wanted to highlight. And now I'd like to talk about the actual discussions and challenges that we saw from the different conversations that we had. Now, if you go to the next slide, in general, we can categorize DevOps teams today in existing companies into, like, very high level, into mature and immature teams. In Salto, we have a more elaborate model for maturity at 5 different levels, but here we can keep it very simple. We can see immature teams. Typically, these will be teams who are using change sets or change sets like tools, for example, click deploy, etc., right? These teams would typically lack process, meaning they're not yet in a state where they have a proper process for their change management, and their set of challenges is very different than those of mature teams, where the process exists. Sometimes it can be challenging, and it is implemented in one of two ways, right? Either using commercial tools like Salto or some other tools out there, or that they build their own using, let's say, Jenkins with SFDX CLI or GitHub Actions or Circle CI, GitLab, Bitbucket, whatever. They build their own CI/CD pipeline that implements those processes. Obviously, the set of challenges and the discussions with organizations in different maturity level, as well as their expectations from DevOps is very different. Let's try and dive a little bit deeper and discuss what we saw in those discussions. So what are the top issues the DevOps teams are still concerned about with immature teams? And there, typically, the number one challenge that we see is an organizational challenge. It's not even about any technicality or how to actually implement the process. It's much more about how to structure the team and the process that the team should use. For example, I was talking with the director of Salesforce in a company which is growing very, very quickly. And that Salesforce team just grew from 2 to 8 team members. And this is a company which is trying to get ready for an IPO. And his main dilemma is, okay, what kind of skill sets do I need in my team? Most of his team, on average, has 9 months of experience working in Salesforce. Can they actually have a very robust change management pipeline, like state-of-the-art CI/CD? Not sure that that's what they should focus on right now. How should they structure the team in terms of, is it just a single flat team? Are there architects and developers and admins? What is the division of responsibilities between them? And then what kind of process should they run? Should they be using shared sandboxes or should they all have personal sandboxes? So these first set of questions is extremely common with teams which are just starting with their DevOps practice. Now, in many cases, they might be a little bit confusing or confused also, those teams, because they are coming from using existing tools, but they never actually implemented a DevOps process. So in many cases, they're still lacking rationalization for that stricter process. And in many cases, I've been talking with directors and VPs who are actually getting pushbacks from their teams because the team members are saying, well, that tool, that process that you'd like to start implementing, it is making us go slower. It is impacting our velocity. And typically my answer in those cases is, yes, it does make you go slower because you have other requirements that you'd like to fulfill. You'd like to reduce risk. You'd like to make sure that you follow a certain process which has traceability in it, and you can very well understand what it is that you're doing, etc. So if you are in a team which is just about to embark on this journey, these are questions that you need to make sure that you have good answers for, because if your main driver, for example, for short-term driver for implementing a DevOps process in a small team is around just increasing your velocity, there might be an issue with expectation setting right now within your organization. Now, typically then the next step is questions on how to start. And there are 2 approaches. The first one, which is typically probably destined to fail, is to start running, start sprinting basically. Start with planning and implementing a full CI/CD kind of solution. What we saw with most teams that are trying to do a crawl, walk, run kind of thing, because they want to be able to get faster to ROI, to have a quick return on investment. And for this, they need to start seeing values early on. And these values can be around, well, now we can actually roll back bad changes. Now we have visibility. We have tools for collaboration between the team members. We can make sure that Whenever Gil makes a change, it doesn't steps on Scott's toes, etc. So that desire for fast ROI is also very much tied to that. Let's start by a crawl walk running and make sure that we have a proper rationalization. So in that aspect, and I've been to many Dreamforces, I think we're still seeing very similar discussions for teams who are just starting. I think there's better understanding that they need to adopt DevOps processes because it basically became the standard. I think there are still questions on the rationalization, and that's one of the things that in many cases we're working with our customers. Now, if we switch gears and talk about mature teams. Now, mature teams are teams that they have some kind of process already. They already understand that they can't be cowboys going directly into production and making changes, etc. Their set of concerns and challenges tend to be much more technical, practical, related to their day-to-day. For example, many of them are struggling with deploying changes to profiles and permission sets because these can be really complicated. And then you've got different admin and developers all working in parallel on different features that somehow touch those same profiles and permission sets. And it can be very challenging to actually understand what's going on. So I've had discussions with teams of varying sizes, from hundreds of developers and admins to 4, who basically just excluded profiles and permission sets from their DevOps process and just managing them manually because of those challenges. Another very common challenge is around complex promotions that lead to conflicts. And a very common scenario here is, for example, you have a team of multiple developers working in parallel on different features. So they're utilizing different feature branches. Somehow, because of many cases, technical debt or poor technical design and architecture, multiple of those changes are actually touching the same Apex class. And then you've got a mess because everyone starts conflicting with everyone. Everyone needs to understand everyone's work. And many of the current tooling are not that great in helping with that, especially when those conflicts are also in relatively complex metadata types, let's say flows. It can be very hard to actually deal with these types of complex promotions. Yeah. Now, another very common challenge is in those larger teams, it can be very common to have a few developers and a larger group of admins, and some of these admins can be less technical. Now, less technical in the mean that they're not experts in Git, they're not very comfortable with dealing with XMLs, etc. And in those cases, it can be challenging to integrate the admins into the process, because as soon as they start needing to deal with Git or with conflicts and XMLs, etc., they feel lost. And it leads too many organizations to basically get to a process which is optimized either for developers or for admins. That the process is basically just for Apex classes, or that the process is just for declarative metadata. And obviously that's not optimal. You're losing on lots of the rationale and value of having a proper DevOps process, and many are still struggling with that. Same goes with back promotions. I won't talk about it too much, but back promotions, for those who are unfamiliar with the concept, is when you do changes directly in higher environments, let's say in production, how do you bring those changes back to your lower environments, let's say to dev? Now, typically the first question is, why did you do a change directly in production? But let's say that you had a good reason for that. The challenge here is that in many cases, it would lead to conflicts, again, because the development environment already changed. And this will lead to all of the challenges that we're seeing with conflicts and also with admins in those cases. Now, we've been talking a lot in the past few years about configuration data, for example, for CPQ or for industries. It's still an unsolved problem. Scott, what kind of discussions did you have with customers on configuration data?
Yeah, so some of the conversations I had at Dreamforce was, especially with these mature teams, they had a homegrown pipeline using something like Jenkins or GitHub Actions to deploy using SFDX. However, they were still using maybe like a data loader to make changes directly to CPQ, and there was no way to make, or I should say, it wasn't very easy to make minor changes, like let's say updating a price rule instead of having to update everything related to that product. So it was very difficult, or some of the people that came up to the booth that I was talking to were having kind of struggling with smaller changes to CPQ in a way that they had already solved for making those changes to the metadata.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Yeah, that the annoying challenge, by the way, with this is that conceptually, all of these are just configuration, right? The fact that CPQ, so steel bricks or industries or velocity, had to implement those configuration using data records is irrelevant to the users eventually, but it leads to so many technical challenges like not being able to properly version control them or to deploy them, etc. And these are still unsolved problems in many cases. And the last challenge that I saw with mature teams, which actually caught me by surprise, is that impact analysis, meaning the ability to actually understand what's going to be the impact of a change that you're planning to do, as well as visibility into the configuration. So understanding what is it that you already have implemented is still a challenge. The reason it caught me by surprise is that there are great free tools out there to help with that. One of them is by Salto. It's not the only one, but we have a free tier that helps with impact analysis and configuration visibility. And honestly, what I told everyone that share those challenges with me is just, well, guys, it's a solved problem. Just use the free tier in Salto. There are some other free tools for that as well. You shouldn't struggle with that. All right. So after talking on some of the challenges that we saw and talked about, if we go to the next slide, this one, by the way, is marketing made me add this sentence. Let's see how we at Salto can help with all of those. Because I finished Dreamforce this year really pumped. Yeah, we're talking to like hundreds and thousands of people, and it's a huge conference. There are like all those mascots, so everyone is pumped. But I was pumped because honestly, all of those challenges that we're talking with customers and prospects about, we have a great solution for those. There's a great fit between the challenges and what we can help with, making it much more fun. So many companies, DevOps is like the worst part of their day-to-day when dealing with Salesforce. And we make it fun. We make it nice, smooth. So I will hand it back over to Scott to show it to you. Back to you,
Great,
Scott.
thanks for the recap, Gil. Just as a reminder, we've got a poll open. Almost all of you have answered, but for the remaining of you, if you wouldn't mind taking a look at that poll and giving your answers, got some pretty interesting insights so far. Just wanted to share a few results I saw. So one of the first questions was, what are your plans with Agentforce? So we've actually got about 15% of you that said you're already starting to use it, which is great. And then about 25 to 30% of you said you're going to plan on using it within the next 6 to 12 months. And then about 60% of you saying no concrete plans yet. I thought that was a pretty interesting. And then actually, since we were just talking about configuration data changes, about 13% of you making changes directly in production, 38% of you using a data loader, and then about half using a dedicated change management tool for configuration data. So really interesting to see here. Now let me jump just 1 second while I switch my screen here. All right, so I want to walk you through the Salto platform, kind of talking about how Salto uh, helps users all across kind of the maturity spectrum uh, get better with their with managing their Salesforce instances. So first, I wanted to show you in Salto. This is my Salto environment. I'm connected to 3 environments here. I'm connected to 2 sandboxes, a dev and a UAT box, and then also my production instance. So a few things I want to show you here in Salto is that like Gil was mentioning, Salto has an impact analysis tool. It's built in. We also have a free tier that includes just the impact analysis bit. But just to kind of show you what that looks like, Salto is going to first fetch all of the metadata. And then if you're also using Salto for configuration data like CPQ, we'll fetch all of the configuration data records as well. And then you'll be able to see it all in this Explore tab here. So if I take a look under here, I can see, for example, what are all the flows that I've got set up. I can jump into a particular flow. This is my flow when a new trial is opened. And then at the very bottom, Salto is also going to pull out all of the dependencies that this flow has on other configuration elements in your environment. So other fields it's calling and so on. Now, if I take a look here, it's saying that this flow is relying on actually another flow, and as well as a custom field and a standard field. So if you're familiar with Salesforce's, where is this being used? This is something obviously you can do for custom fields in Salesforce. With Salto, we can do that for not only custom fields, but standard fields, as well as other parts of your configuration metadata. So for example, if I were to take a look at this flow that's being triggered by another flow, if I come down here in Salto, I can see that it's being referenced by that flow, and it depends on this quick action. Now, this is all built into Salto. It's part of the platform, so any user can come in and quickly understand, where are my configurations being used? What are those dependencies? And then also wanted to mention that Salto can do the same for CPQ configuration data. So if I take a look at, for example, this is a price rule that I've recently set up in my that's in my UAT environment. And if I come into Salto, even though this is configuration data, so this is a data record, Salto is pulling that in, processing like it is metadata, and you can still see those relationships. So I can see where that price rule is being referenced, what it depends on, and I can really understand this. Now, the reason I wanted to show this is because Salto is also going to use this as part of the deployment process to make that deployment process as smooth as possible, because we fully understand those dependencies, where those are being referenced, and so on. Now, I'm going to go into some of the deployment capabilities in Salto, but just as a reminder, we've got the Q&A open. So jump into that Q&A and please feel free to ask any questions or follow along in the chat. All right, so I wanted to go through kind of an example with Salto, because one of the things that we'd heard at Dreamforce is promotions, conflicts can be challenging. And that's something, one of the questions we had asked is, how often do you run into conflicts during deployment? So 87% of you said not a lot or rarely, and then 13% of you said practically every deployment. So we kind of saw this as well. There were some times when we talked to some participants at the booth that really ran into this a lot, whereas some weren't running into this as often as others. However, if you've ever run into a deployment conflict, it can be quite a headache to solve. So let me show you how we can do this in Salto. So the example that I want to show you here is, again, I've got those 3 environments. I got a dev, UAT box, and I've also got production. Now, I am ready to deploy a change to my customer engineering Apex class that I've got here. Now, this is coming in. You can see I just made a very, very simple change here as part of the class update, and I'm ready to go ahead and deploy that change. Now, in Salto, we can pull in any changes that you're making through SFDX, open up a pull request, and you can see that specific change in Salto. So I've already done that. I've already integrated my repo, and I'm ready to go ahead and deploy that change. However, I went to deploy this to my UAT environment and I see I've got a conflict. Okay, so let me see what that conflict is. So if I click on resolve, it looks like someone's already made changes to that customer engineering class directly in either maybe they deployed directly to UAT, but regardless, I didn't have those changes in, and now I need to account for those changes. Here in Salto, let me make this a little bit bigger so we can see the full screen here. If I click resolve again, oh, sorry, one more. If I click resolve, and now I can see the full screen, but it's basically telling me, hey, these are the changes that you're trying to push through. This is what we already see in the UAT environment. So what do you want to do with this conflict? One to also note here, if you have multiple conflicts, Salto can show you each conflict in that you've got in those Apex classes, and you can resolve them each separately. So here it's basically asking me, how do I want to resolve this? Do I want to take my changes? In other words, the changes I'm pushing through? Do I want to take the target changes or the changes that are already existing in the environment? Or do I want to actually include them both? So maybe I want to include them both, and I can go ahead and click on apply, and I can go ahead and apply the conflict resolution. Salto is going to rerun our Salto side validation, just making sure that these are changes that we can make into the target environment. And then I can go ahead and deploy that change up into my UAT environment. So let me go ahead and deploy that change just to kind of review what we're doing here. This is going to modify this Apex class to add in my changes while keeping those changes that were already in place in my UAT environment there. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this change with Salto. At the end of this deployment, I will get a summary of the changes that were pushed, and that can serve as its instant documentation of the changes that I just pushed, in this case, to my UAT environment. Now, coming back to the compare and deploy, if I go into the history, Salto is going to show you all the history of all the changes that you're pushing to these environments. Now, let's say that I want to go ahead and push those changes up into production. But as I can see here, there's actually two different deployments that took place. The first one, well, this one is getting reviewed. So this first one, this was that change that another user, not myself, had already pushed through. And that was that change that initially got the customer engineering class added. The second change, if I come back to the compare and deploy, is the change that I just pushed through that had that conflict. I resolved that conflict by accepting both of my changes. Now in Salto, what you can do is if I want to promote that up to my production environment, you can click any of your past deployments. So you can even add multiple deployments together, select promote, and then move it into the next environment. Now, something I did want to mention is because I had done that deployment that moved kind of two parts to that one single file. Let's say that I've only tested kind of one part of that change to the Apex class, and I want to only move that part forward to production. So in this case, in other words, that first kind of addition to my customer engineering Apex class, that's what I want to add. I don't want to add the one that I just did right now. I still need to do some testing on it. So just to confirm, it's going to be this change that just very, very simple change to the Apex class here. But because in Salto, we're looking at each deployment individually, you can also choose to promote just that deployment. So I can go ahead and click promote from here. I can select production. So let me go ahead and select my production environment, create deployment, and it's going to take that change and just that change that was pushed to my UAT environment and then deploy that up into production. Now, while this is running, I did want to show kind of another example. So what I showed right now was, how making changes to Apex classes, running with resolving conflicts. What about changes that admins are making as well? So let's say that you've added a new field, maybe you've added a new flow, and you want to also get that updated in Salto. So here I've actually already created a deployment in Salto called add new flow. So with Salto, the way that deployments are going to work is you can run a comparison inside of Salto that's going to compare those two environments next to each other. So in my case, my UAT environment and my production environment. It's going to show all of the changes that we see in those environments and allow you to select from those changes which one of those that you want to push up. I've already gone ahead and started this deployment. I've already added this particular flow. And as soon as I add that flow to the deployment, Salto is going to run that impact analysis or dependency analysis behind the scene and make sure that we have everything that we need to make that deployment successful. So in this case, I'm actually missing this custom field in production. And also that flow that this flow itself is calling is also missing in production. So I need to go ahead and add both of those to the deployment. Now, if I come back to the selected column, now I can see that I've got those flows selected, and I've also got that custom field that has been added. Now, something that we heard at Dreamforce as well is even with those organizations that have very mature DevOps process, dealing with profiles, dealing with field level security can be quite tricky. And we saw many organizations just choosing to kind of omit that from their change process and doing those directly in the org, directly in the environments instead of accidentally overwriting the profiles, making those changes. So with Salto, what we can do is when a field is selected to add to the next environment, if you notice down here, it says that it's being referenced by by all of these different profiles. Now, Salto is unique in that if I were to select all 9 of these changes, all 9 of these profile changes, Salto will only deploy that specific change that's being made to that profile. What I mean by that is if I go into, for example, maybe the solutions manager profile, you can see here that the difference between these profiles in UAT and prod is vast. There's a lot of different permissions, a lot of different custom fields. So instead of just overwriting it, Salto is just going to select that one change that's going to add that field level security for this specific field, and I can go ahead and deploy just that change. So again, even though I've selected all 9 of these profiles to be deployed, Salto is actually just targeting the changes related to this specific field to be deployed. And with Salto, it's as easy as moving forward with the deployment process. This is asking me because it's in the middle of synchronizing those environments because I just deployed. Actually, I can just go ahead and run this. And I could go ahead and move forward with the deployment process and deploy from here. So let me go ahead and click on preview deployment. This step is going to run what we call like Salto side validation, which is going to just make sure that we've got everything that we need in order to deploy those changes up into the next environment. Now, while this is running, I also wanted to show you another type of deployment. So I've talked a few times about configuration data. So CPQ, industries, billing, those managed packages that are storing their configurations as data records. With Salto, you can fetch all of those configuration data records and you can manage them just like your other metadata. So let me show you an example of what that could look like. So let's say that you've made some changes in the lower environments that you're ready to go ahead and push up to production related to maybe CPQ configuration data. So with Salto, I can choose the environment that I made the changes in. I can go ahead and give it a title. Let me select that again. And I can go ahead and give it a title. I'll call this CPQ deployment and go ahead and create a compare and deploy. Now you'll notice that Salto in this compare and deploy, Salto is showing you all the differences in the environment, not just the changes in terms of the metadata, but also the configuration data as well. And it's showing under the installed packages. So in here, if I wanted to add, for example, I've got that was a price rule, if I can find it. This price rule up here called, oh no, it was a product rule. So around the paid trial, I can go ahead and add that to the deployment. And if there were any dependencies, Salto will track those dependencies, make sure that we have everything that we need in order to deploy those configuration data changes up into that next environment. Now, the great thing about this is if you were to move forward with deploying those changes using Salto, if I come back to compare and deploy and go to history, the history of all of those changes would be in Salto. By the way, all of these changes can be exported to a CSV file. So you really get really good visibility to all the changes that are happening in the environment, not just changes coming from Apex classes or changes going from custom fields, but all the changes that are happening in the environments. Now, I also did want to mention really quickly here with Salto, it's going to track changes over time. So every single time that we see changes that are happening, both coming from changes that you're deploying through Salto or changes that are happening directly in the environment, Salto is going to track them here in what we call the change log. So if you can see here, every single time we detect changes, it creates another row, and this gets automatically synchronized with the environment. So again, just making sure that you're keep on track and get really good visibility into every single change that is happening in the environment. This works really well with some of our monitoring capabilities. So this is where you can set up specific notifications to be sent out whenever changes are made directly in the platform. So I've got a quick example to show you here. So anytime a flow is modified directly in Salto, I've told Salto, please send me an email. We can send also this to multiple emails or to a Slack channel or a Teams channel, and you'll get a notification like this here that says we've got an element that has changed. We'll tell you exactly what changed here. And this works really nicely with our change log, because another thing that the change log can do is it can provide a snapshot to restore back to in case anything has been removed, misconfigured. You can go back to that snapshot before that item was removed or misconfigured, click restore, and then Salto is going to show you all of the changes from now into that point in time, and then allow you to select which of those changes do you want to roll back. So instead of having to do a full rollback, you can do a partial rollback without impacting any other changes that were pushed to production during that period in time. I'm going to pause here and just check to see if we've got any questions. No questions so far, but if you do have any, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A or drop those into the chat. Now let me come back to the deployment here. And here I can see, going back to that deployment where I was adding a new flow, I've already gone through the kind of first round of Salto side validations. Again, just making sure we've got all those dependencies in place, which we do, and I can go ahead and run my validation in Salesforce to deploy those changes after the validation runs. Assuming that it passes, I can go ahead and deploy those changes into production. All right. Any other any questions in the Q&A? No. Oh, I see one question. When will we have to create a development branch as part of the branching strategy? Great question, VJ. So Salto is quite unique in that the way that Salto can work is that we will integrate with your existing SFDX repository. And basically each branch in each environment that you're connected to in Salto, so be it your developer, UAT box, your production environment, each of those will have their own branches. And then you can open up a feature branch to kind of compare against and then deploy in using Salto. And then got another question from Jay. How to keep other/multiple sandboxes in sync? Great question, Jay. So to keep multiple sandboxes in sync with Salto, if you come back to the compare and deploy, one thing that you can do in Salto is that you can compare any two environments. So you can compare two sandbox environments, you can compare a lower environment to your production environment. And it's going to show you at all times, it will show you, how out of sync those environments are. One thing to note is that Salto is bidirectional. So let's say that you have made changes in production. There's been hot fixes applied, and you need to get those changes propagated back down to the lower environments. With Salto, it's as easy as selecting production as your source environment, and then one of your lower environments as the target. And let me just call this example. Salto will instantly create that comparison that will show you all of the differences between, in my case, production and UAT. And it will show me all of the changes that I would, potentially have to deploy to keep those in sync. Now, these operations, by the way, these comparison operations, they can be ran at any time, and you don't even need to continue on to deploy those changes, but it can be a great way to keep, kind of get that visibility into how out of sync your sandbox is from production, as well as that monitoring feature to notify when changes are made directly in production can get you really good visibility into those changes. All right, so this kind of completes my high-level demo of some of those features that we talked about in Salto. Just as a recap, using Salto to plan your changes by understanding dependencies where those configurations are being used. Salto can be used to create a unified process for admins and developers to promote those changes. And then don't let your merge conflicts slow down deployments, showing you how in Salto, we can help you to create a more consistent deployment conflict strategy. And then using Salto to include configuration data in your deployment pipeline. So you don't have to have kind of two separate processes, but rather one process for all sets of your configuration. Now, I wanted to also share the post. Here we go. I just launched the ending poll. Now I'm still going to stick around. So if you got questions, please feel free to stay on and answer your questions here. But if you do need to jump off, please take a look at the ending poll, and we'd love to hear your feedback. And then also make sure you enter in your address, just in case we draw you as one of our lucky winners that we'll be sending Salto swag to. And then saw another question here from VJ. When we create feature branches out of the QA branch, then how can we merge those changes into the respective dev branch? Good question, VJ. So with Salto, if you need to merge changes from, like, for example, you've pushed changes to QA and need to move those back down to dev. In Salto, how that would work is doing one of those deployments where you're comparing, UAT or let me just double check QA to dev, and then you can actually push those back down using Salto to keep that dev branch aligned with QA. And VJ, we can make sure to follow up with some more specific examples in case you have any follow-up questions. And for anyone that's about to jump off, please take a look at the ending poll. We'd love to hear any feedback you might have. Again, I'm going to stick around, so if you got any questions, please pepper us with questions. And thank you for joining today. And again, we will be following up after the call with more information about how to get started with Salto, a little bit more about some references, some of our documentation, and then also a link to this recording. Thank you, Ryan. And again, if you're jumping off, make sure you jump into the poll. We'd love to hear your feedback, and then make sure you put in your address. We'll be drawing a couple of lucky winners to send some Salto swag to, in case you weren't able to jump by or stop by our booth at Dreamforce. All right, so I think we've got all the questions answered. And if there are no other questions, we're probably gonna go ahead and end the webinar soon. Please make sure you fill out the poll. We'd love to hear any feedback that you have, and we look forward to following up after the webinar.